Thank you very much, ma'am, for this generous introduction. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm pleased to be here again as a speaker at the annual conference of the Institute of Cultural Diplomacy. I take this opportunity to congratulate the Institute, and particularly to Director of Institute of Diplomacy, Mark, for holding again this very elaborate conference, which actually brings here many great names of different countries who will share their experience in observations about issues of different aspects of culture's influence and cultural interaction with human rights. You know, when you talk about human rights and state policies and actions taken by those who are involved in policy and implementation of human rights, you will find the current situation around the world very complicated. In some cases, very disappointing. You know, for almost 15 years, particularly after the war in Iraq and Afghanistan, we hear that calls from some practitioners and even academics that it is very difficult now to vigorously and unrelentingly implement and enforce the human rights, which is becoming a luxury in a very complicated situation around the world. Well, it argues that in order to provide other aspects of security that also is conducive to the human rights, you have to undermine some of these rights, and you have not to actually respect some of these rights. Well, you have heard many things about this. When in the United States, the states was actually surveilling, extended surveillance of citizens and their phones, communications. There was a lot of, fuss about it. But then there was an argument that, well, we are facing threats of terrorism. In order to, respond to these threats, we have to take some certain, measures that might undermine some of these rights that people have. But the counter-argument here is that while such actions, such measures, can provide security in the short term, it might undermine security in the long term. This is something I have been talking about for many years, that short-term security should not undermine long-term priorities for security, which often does this. This is something that you have seen it in your lives, and also if you look at the history, there were other examples that happened. But security is important, of course. Security by itself is a human right. Any government can base its legitimacy on justice and security. Security to protect the population, the citizens. In justice, to do justice to people, the rule of law. So the rule of law is not against the human rights. However, security is not against security by itself is a human right. Therefore, the balance needs to be there, the balance of security in protection of human rights. I would like to talk this morning about three issues here. First is the state policies in human rights. That's one. Second, the notion of human security, which is a new notion. It's becoming a discourse in the political and legal parlance since 1990s. And then how this human security, interacts or affects the international human rights regime that we have. Is it competing with it, or is it complementing it? Although there's no clear answer yet whether the human security notion or discourse that we heard today and everywhere, whether it's in the corridors of the United Nations, in the corridors of power in different countries, or in academia, whether it is competing with human rights or whether it is complementing it. Well, I don't have a clear answer. We will discuss it later. Now, let's take the human rights and state policies. There's always a relativism between moral principles and the foreign policy. Foreign policy does not mean that foreign policy is devoid of moral principles. However, there's a relativism. To what extent you base your foreign policy on moral principles. That's why there's a topic that I teach too, and that's the ethics and decision-making at the national level. Ethics. What is what is ethical and what is effective, and what is ethical and effective things. These are the more academic discussions. I don't want to, take your time on this. However, let's see, when we talk about states, policies, and human rights, one has to realize that human rights is a right which is entitled by human being as a human being, regardless of where he lives, what is social status. It is individual. So it is individual. The states cannot limit it unless there is a clause of rule of law. When you put somebody in jail, you limit his movements. Well, that's the rule of law. But other than that, you cannot limit it. The state cannot limit it. It's not alienable. So that is the real thing of the human rights we have in abstract. But how states deal with it? Principles and policy. In principles and policies, when states make policies, judgments, they subject everything to judgment. Judgment is not a fact, you know that. Judgment is interpretation. It is subjective. It's not objective. Whether law, the rule of, the human rights, it's objective. Same thing, it is the responsibility of the state to respect, to protect, and to fulfill the human rights. What do I mean by these? To respect means not to violate it. If somebody is entitled to free speech, free movement, you respect it by not violating it. You protect it. Protected means that the state should make sure that others do not violate it. And then to fulfill it, to establish measures, mechanisms, in order to allow the people to enjoy this human rights. However, human rights in different countries, you know this, many countries have signed this convention, the treaties on human rights, but do they all observe it? No. In many cases, it filters through cultural, social, and political filters. Look, I'll give you an example of in the Afghanistan constitution, the new constitution, which was adopted in 2004. It actually declares respect for the universal Human Rights Declaration. It respects that and observe that. On the other paragraph of the same Constitution says, no laws can be adopted if it is in variance to the principles of the Islamic faith. Now, sometimes they do clash with each other. But in practical, you have two. Therefore, the human rights in all these societies gets filtered through social, cultural, political, and whatever you call it. So it is not universal. States pick and choose things, which is not essentially the principles of observing the rule of law, the human rights. It's individual, it's unalienable. Sometimes this affects the lives of population drastically. In routine time, maybe not much, but when it comes to the foreign policy of the state, it does. Look at the history about 30 years ago, or 35 years ago. 35 years ago when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. And then it was the Cold War. That was the last battlefield of Cold War. And to counter this invasion, many very extremist people were mobilized to fight with the same fervor of ideology, the Soviet ideology. Well, that served the policy at that time because these people fought them. Whether they were from Afghanistan, whether from the region, whether they came from across the oceans, they fought them. But what happened after that? That created the major problem for security, long-term security. This created the security in the short term, but created insecurity in the long term. Al-Qaeda is a product of that time. Now, even after the post-Taliban period, you see, the US-led coalition, NATO, are fighting in Afghanistan. They call it global war on terror, which they fight terrorism. But at the same time, there's building democracy in Afghanistan, post-Taliban. And Afghanistan has changed drastically, I think. It made many achievements in democratic changes in Afghanistan. But the problem is that when you fight terrorism and building democracy, then you pick and choose your tools. To fight terrorism, you enlist the cooperation of the same people who are against democracy, who are not interested in democracy. They fight. And then we build democracy, and the tools that you have are not enough to build the institutions. So therefore, in the short term, those people who fight the terrorism as a means of fighting global terror, they provide you, they build you, they create you some kind of a short-term security. But long-term security is undermined. Because those people, that's why in countries like Afghanistan and many other countries, it is very hard to implement transitional justice. Those people who did then, you need them later on. When you need them, you cannot persecute them. So transitional justice becomes a sacrifice, a victim of this kind of a policy. Let me talk briefly about I don't know how much time I have, about this notion of human security. Human security actually was a terminology that emerged mostly in the 1990s, mostly from the United Nations. And, well, it has been defined in different ways, but finally, the very brief definition of it is the human security as protecting people from fear and from want. People who fear from something, you have to protect them. People who are want something. So it is the freedom from fear, freedom from want. And not now, but something that people will believe that it will be there tomorrow too. If today you free people from fear of hunger, fear of disease, fear of crime, or you free them from want, access to livelihood, work, and other needs that people may have. If you free them today, they will not act accordingly unless they believe that it will be also available tomorrow. When there is uncertainty like this, you get all these problems: crimes, corruption, everything. Survival mentality actually go hand in hand with corruption and crime. So this is, on the other hand, they are talking about 7 aspects of human security. These 7 aspects are very, very, broadly, established. They are economic security, safety, food security, health security, environmental security, personal security, community security, and political security. Of course, states can provide some of this, but it is something that affects everybody beyond the states. Earlier, Minister talked about the environmental degradation. That affects everybody. People have to move from place to place when the livelihood is not available anymore, when water is not available anymore. I was covering Central Asia in the 1990s as an editor-at-large for the Voice of America. Even during that 10 years I was covering that, we saw the Aral Sea is shrinking together because of the degradation. And the people and the dust of the salt dust was taken by the wind and spread all over the fields, farms, and people had to move from there to other places. So it affects everybody. It is not only one state that's affected, but everybody is affected. So how you deal with that kind? On the other hand, when that happens, you see people are moving from one country to another. Massive immigration that you see today. Not from war-afflicted countries, but from poverty-hidden countries. From economic problems, from environmental degradations, from disease, from bad government. They move. Then, as the human security calls for, as the focus is people, not states. You have to protect people now. People, not only by the country, because they are out of that country. So every country gets a responsibility to protect them, to serve them, people. Now, when you see millions of people are moving from one area to another, and they are no longer the citizen of a state. Some of them are stateless. Some are not, anymore a citizen of a particular or the country that they came from. So it has become a responsibility, international responsibility. Is it going to be part of the international human rights regime or not? That's the problem. People now make political decisions about it. But do we think that, is it going to complement the human rights? If it does, then what is the regime? What is the mechanism for it? Or if competes with it, because when you talk about human security, the states pick and choose. They cannot do all things at once, so they have pick and choose, which undermines the very regime principles of universal human rights. So let me conclude with one question. This is that does human security discourse complement international human rights law or compete with it? Some observers, not all, some observers caution against assuming that the discourse of human security complement the international law on human rights, rather than competing with it. It is complementing or competing. Some questions. International human rights are based on individual capacities to claim their human rights from the state. States are obliged to respect, protect, and fulfill individual human rights, as I discussed earlier. By contrast, the human security discourse is one that allows states to convert human rights obligation into policy talks, making policy choices as to which aspect of human security they might focus on. The individual has much stronger standing in international human rights law than he has or she has in human security discourse. The discussion of human security depoliticizes standard threats to human well-being, while the international law of human rights recognizes that threats to human well-being are inherently political. Moreover, the suggestion in the human security discourse that some human rights should have priority over others undermines the principles of indivisibility which is crucial to the human rights regime. So maybe the compromise is that when human security focuses on everyone in the world, implying that states should take on new responsibility to non-citizens facing these threats, new state duties and new international mechanisms are required to remedy these threats. Thus, the narrower view of human security, which does complement the human rights, adding some other aspects to human rights and mechanism to implement it. I thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Jalali. It was excellent to have learned from you in that opportunity, and I know there are so many more things that we can ask of you, given your great experience as a professor in the USA, as former Minister of Interior of Afghanistan, and given your next posting, which I'm not sure has been announced yet, but for many reasons, I think this is an excellent opportunity for us to engage in questions with Professor Jalali. We're also doing well with time, so we have at least a good 10, 15 minutes. So in that sense, don't hesitate. As always, if you could briefly introduce yourself when posing the question so he knows who you are, that would be excellent. We'll start here on the front.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jalali, for your remarks. I have a question. In your speech, you highlighted the issue of food insecurity, hunger, and malnutrition, which is the issue of South Asia at large. And how would you, sir, relate this issue of hunger, malnutrition, and food security with the human rights? What position it has how much it is important when we talk about human rights, and what states should be doing to counter this challenge of food insecurity and malnutrition?
Would you prefer us to take a few together, or maybe one?
Yes, I think we'll take another question. Yes.
So we'll take maybe three together, and we can...
Dr. Amir Laka from London, founder and chairman of Humanitarian and Charitable One Trust. I've got two questions. One is, the state has a responsibility towards its citizens as far as welfare and security is concerned. When there are refugees generated from that state and they go to other nations, is it still not the responsibility of that state to look after those refugees? That is one. Second, what is the one thing that you would do to bring about peace in Afghanistan?
Okay, let me take you the hunger. Hunger, as I said, is part of the human security. In the human rights, the people are entitled to choose the place that they live, the work they want to do, and also the security as they should enjoy. But hunger is something that's different economic and other problems. And when we talk the security from hunger, it's a responsibility of states. Well, international organization can help, but basically it is the policy in the actual states. States should take care of this. It is not in the realm, it's most in the realm of human security rather than the international human rights regime. We spoke about refugees that leave countries. Refugees leave countries for different reasons. Wars, some of them are forced to leave the country because of the economic problems, the environment degradation, and war, conflict. Some leave because they want a better life somewhere else, and they want to move to another country. The states are responsible. Both states who receive these people are responsible to protect them as human beings. That's human rights. In the states, the states from where the refugees come, they are responsible to, first of all, look after them, not to leave the country. And secondly, when they leave, to deal with the countries of the host countries in order to find a solution to it. Well, recently there are many refugees coming from different countries, particularly from Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria to Europe. As far as Afghanistan is concerned, Afghanistan has signed protocols with these countries that those who are not eligible as refugees and cannot be accepted or asylum, they will be taken back by the country. As we speak, 50 Afghans are now on the plane going back to Afghanistan. I think this is some kind of arrangement with the countries that should be made. With Afghanistan, there's no one thing they can say to Afghanistan. Afghanistan actually is at war now for 4 decades. And a country, you cannot find another country, maybe in the world, that 82 years, in the past 82 years, 3 major powers invaded that country. In 1990s, the British Empire, at that time was in India, invaded in 1990s, inconclusively. In 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded that small country, fought for 9 years there, and left. And then after 9/11, 2001, NATO and 40 other countries actually intervened in Afghanistan. It is in 15 years war. What do you expect of a country like this, a small country which never attacked any other country in the recent past, I'm saying, which was a peaceful country, small country. But Afghanistan problem was caused by others. You know, once I was asking an Afghan old man, when I was Minister of Interior, somebody complained about the situation. I said, "What do you want the world to do for you?" He said, "What I want the world cannot do for me." I said, "What is it?" He said, can they undo what they did to us? They cannot do that. So therefore, today in Afghanistan, during the Cold War, 2 superpowers are fighting. One was occupying the country, the other one was trying to push them out. In the part, the country was destroyed. Its institution destroyed. The economic base was destroyed. And 1.2 to 1.5 million of people in the rural areas were killed, according to UN estimates. So now, when the superpowers, the Cold War was over and they left the country, some smaller power in the region wanted to, take advantage of the situation. a great game turned into a smaller game, little game. And that continues even today. And then the legacy of supporting extremists during the war with the Soviet Union continues to have a long shadow over the peace and security in Afghanistan. Today in Afghanistan, according to the recent speech by the U.S. commander in Afghanistan, my good friend General Nicholson, said that 20 terrorist groups are fighting in Afghanistan. They are not from Afghanistan. They come from other countries. These 20 groups, some are international groups, like Al-Qaeda or Daesh or ISIL, you call it, or ISIS, you call it. Some are coming from other countries. They come from China, the East Turkestan Islamic movement. From Uzbekistan Islamic movement. Come from Pakistan Taliban. They come from Lashkar-e-Taiba or others. They come from the Jundullah from Central Asia. So there are all these groups are fighting because there is a country that is broken, and they don't want to be in Afghanistan. They want to actually build that capacity to do bad things to their own countries. So therefore, I think a regional resolution is the key to this, with international support. Just 2 weeks ago, I was in Astana in Kazakhstan for a kind of Astana club group. And my call was this, that we call regional support. Just 2 weeks ago, there was a conference in Amritsar in Delhi on the Heart of Asia conference. Heart of Asia started in 2011 in Istanbul, and that's the only body that focuses on stability in Afghanistan in the region. All regional countries are represented. If you look at the speeches that was given in 2011, and the last speeches that was given in last month, this month in Amritsar, there's no difference. There's lip service. Every country makes speeches, wants Afghanistan to be stable. But my call in Astana was this, that there are certain countries that look at stability of Afghanistan from different perspectives. Can they find a common denominators? What is stability in Afghanistan that they will accept for that? You have to find that common denominators. Every country wants Afghan stability in Afghanistan, but on their terms. They have, unless that common denominators emerges, it will be very difficult for Afghanistan to see, because everybody has a stake there and they're fighting. However, during the past 15 years, Afghanistan has changed drastically. It is no longer that country, that world. The critical mass for peaceful solution of Afghanistan is there in Afghanistan. Taliban are not coming back to Afghanistan. But the country will suffer for a long time. The sooner the regional countries actually find that common denominator, the sooner the country will be in peace. Otherwise, it may take 5 years, 10 years to bring it in. But Afghans are not going to war again against each other, only against those who are fighting for others in Afghanistan. Thank you.
If you let us, I saw that we have more questions.
Okay.
Thank you.
You know, when you ask a teacher, professor to speak, they will never stop.
You mentioned the possible clash. Sorry, I have a cold today. Between Islamic principles and human rights.
Yes.
But there are many values. I taught Islam and modernity at university level. There are many values within Islam, within the Quran, that do accord with international human rights conventions and all that. For example, there is a verse in the Quran that says human beings are dignified. There are many values can be drawn from this principle. Why can't states, and you were a minister in a government, why can't states promote these values and also encourage jurisprudence and Islamic clerics who promote modern values, modern Islamic values that accord with international law? because that's the only possible way forward. In a modern society, you cannot live within, old values that have no relevance to modern human beings. I think it is possible to reform certain principles, extreme interpretations, I would call them, of the Quran that have been in vogue recently in some people who do not or who misunderstand Islam. So this is as for transitional justice you mentioned. This is a problem not only in Afghanistan, all over the world. And the only solution to this is to focus on the future, because this is really more important than the past. Usually justice is about the past crimes, past events, but it's more important for the people as well, even for the victims and their families, to focus on the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. I totally agree with you. I'm not talking about what is in Islam, what Quran says. I'm talking about the interpretation in different countries. And when I say that it filters through religious, faith, and social and political filters, it means it's not only religion, it's social too. You look around the world, you see how Islam is practiced in different countries. They're very different. During the years that Afghans were fighting against the Soviet Union, there were 7 parties, and they said, we are going to establish an Islamic order in Afghanistan after the Soviet, expulsion. And I asked them, they gave me 7 kind of versions of an Islamic state that they were talking. So they were not even, so this is that interpretation is where it matters. Therefore, for example, in Afghanistan, in freedom of religion, in some Islamic countries, they do not accept it. So therefore, while it becomes a clash with the Universal Human Rights Declarations, I'm talking about these issues, interpretations, not the text of the scripture, of the Holy Book. That's why sometimes I teach in some of these discussions the notion of civic religion. Not only in Islam, but in the Christianity and the other. Civic religion is different from what you actually individuals see, that or the scholars. So I'm talking about social filters, political filters, interpretation filters, religious filters. That actually came in clash. On the transition justice, in 2004, I was part of a group to put together an action plan for transitional justice in Afghanistan. It was future-looking. And the first thing was the building a monument to honor those who killed during the war. The other one was for the government to find people, why they were killed, why they were abused, and the families knew what happened to them. There were thousands of people who were killed during the communist regime in Afghanistan. They wanted to find who did that. And third, it was a kind of admission by those who did, and ask for apology, to pardon from the nation. Reconciliation. So something like what happened in South Africa. That was something we did. But even of the years, even one step of it was not implemented because of the security concerns. People who were involved somehow, even they went to the Parliament issued a kind of a ruling, or that all those who were involved in the civil war are exonerated. The Parliament did that. So in variance to what we did in the action plan. So as long as Afghanistan is secure, I will tell you, it will be very difficult to even touch that action plan of transitional justice. It depends on how stable a country is, how responsible a state is, how confidence it has, and how much trust the state has from the people to do this. And otherwise, this is a tragic thing that is bothering many people in Afghanistan today. Thank you very much, sir.
More questions, sir? We have two more questions, if you let us. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you very much, dear Minister. I'm from Turkey. Dr. Oktar Babuna is a TV channel, A9. Well, it's, you, of course, pointed to problems happening in Afghanistan, but it's not only in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, in many countries, especially in the Middle East. And you pointed also there are 20 different radical groups which are fighting each other in Afghanistan. Well, according to United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the numbers in 2014 are 60 million people abandoned their homes. This is much worse than the Second World War. And also, 11 million Muslims were killed by Muslims in the last few decades. Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. United States invaded Afghanistan. You said also United Kingdom. So there are two sides of this, of course. We understand there is people in the world at the deep state level, organized crime, but there's a problem among the Muslims also. It's not wrong interpretation of the Quran, because in the Quran there is love, there is compassion. There is no compulsion in religion, Allah says. Your religion is yours, my religion is mine. And there are no death penalties for anything in the Quran. But there are death penalties based on the superstitions and fabricated hadiths, so-called sayings of the Prophet. And there are sectarian wars, and there's enmity and hatred. So something needs to be done, but which hasn't been done in the past, because things are getting worse. 2016 is worse than 2015. 15 is worse than the 14. Something else needs to be done. Muslims have to unite around the Quran, and there has to be an intellectual struggle to stop all these crimes, radicalism, and terrorism. Well, I want to know your opinion, your solution, because everybody knows the problems. Problems are everywhere. But what is the real solution which hasn't been done in the past, except smart bombs, except the weapons which were used in the Middle East and in these countries?
Sir, if I had this solution, I would have earned a Nobel Prize for this Peace Prize. But, you know, many years ago, in a capacity like yours as a journalist, I was talking to the famous American political scientist, Samuel Huntington. You know him for his book of the Clash of Civilizations. I asked him that at that time he had not published his book, but he actually published an article on that night, the Clash of Civilization. Later on, he wrote the book. And I said that, well, is it clash of civilization or clash within civilization? Because the globalization and the contact that people find, they go after their neighbor first instead of coming to far-fetched countries. He said, I'm living where I live somewhere. The person who is, disgranted of something, they will come to the neighbor first, not go to the other city to do. So it is, I don't know. This is unfortunate that today, particularly in the Middle East, you see a kind of a tectonic movements, states against states, non-states against states, non-states against non-states, and states collectively against states. As soon as you politicize religion, politicize religion, then you actually not fighting a religious war. You are fighting a political war. So if you depoliticize this, probably you will find a way. Otherwise, you will fight forever. And in the 5th century, not the 5th century, which is about 13th century. 13th century, somebody wrote a book about Al-Milal wal-Nahal in Arabic. In there, he actually listed the number of factions, sects in a religion. There are so many of them. Every day, somebody, because of a political reason, maybe interpreted the religion in a different way and condemn others who are not agreeing with them. This is unfortunately the reason. However, what exacerbates this is bad government, economic degradation, and also the insecurity and instability that cause these things. I don't have a solution to this unless I say that depoliticize the religion, then probably that will help. Thank you very much.
And one final question, please. Here we have one.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Honorable. I'm Francis Adams, a West African-born studying here at the ICD. The situation in Afghanistan is quite sympathetic, where you see big and much more developed countries descending on a small, tiny country, say we are fighting with you. At the same time, you also find out that other organizations or countries come in telling you that we want to help you make peace. During your tenure as Interior Minister, I would be very happy if you would like to share with me or with us the most difficult decision for you in terms of making an independent decision during your tenure as Interior Minister for Afghanistan.
Well, I came in Afghanistan right after the collapse of the Taliban regime, and we're rebuilding Afghanistan, reconstruction. Many countries were there, and they help a lot. And I had to build many things from scratch. Build the police, build the intelligence service, immigration service, all these other, the provincial governments, district governments, municipalities, and all these things. It was not a very, it was very, very difficult job. However, fortunately, many countries helped. For example, in the Ministry of Interior that I was, 3 countries were helping me. Germany was helping with building police because Germany was the godfather of police in Afghanistan in earlier times before the war. United Kingdom was helping me in fighting reduction and destruction of drug trade and drug production. In Japan was helping us in DDR, we call it, demobilization and reintegration of former militias. And of course, other countries like Italy was helping in the justice sector, and United States was building in everything, particularly in the army, building army. All these were very important. The challenge was that different countries came from different perspectives, different visions, different procedures, different levels of commitment, different levels of investment. So these 5 issues that belong to the security sector reform, police, army, justice sector, counterterrorism, narcotics, and DDR, they were all part of one major security sector. But they were just, each one was developed unevenly. That was the major challenge. Particularly when in Afghanistan, the insurgency became more intense in 2006. And police were trained to fight like an army. That was the major challenge. Because the army can bring you immediate security by fighting. Police bring you long-term security by winning the trust of the people, to protect people. So that was the major challenge I faced. Thank you, sir. Thank you.